Hi, this is Steve with Gillett Diesel. Today we are going to be putting back together our H1C turbocharger that we took apart a few months back. So right now we're going to look at all of the parts that we have to put back into the turbocharger and some of the parts that we're going to be reusing. Okay. So we have our container of parts that we collected as we disassembled the turbocharger. We've also laid out everything that comes in our whole set, our genuine whole set repair kit. As you can see, we do get a lot of parts that whole set provides for us to rebuild the turbocharger. A few of the parts that you are going to need to reuse are the oil deflector, so we'll put that here with our stuff, and these part, which is the oil flinger, and the thrust collar, which I cleaned those up previously to the video to save some time. That should be all that you need to reuse for rebuilding our turbo. Okay, so the first thing we're going to show, the second thing I guess we're going to show is the parts that we're going, or the tools that we need to reassemble the turbocharger. Now, these tools are going to be very similar to the tools that we used to take the turbo apart. So, we have a 13mm wrench. We have a 1/4 inch ratchet, a extension with an 8mm, a short 8mm on it. We have a pick, an O-ring pick. We have an 11mm 3/8 socket, deep socket. We have some snap ring pliers, and this is one of the tools that we did not use when we disassembled, but we need this as we reassemble. And the last thing well, the second to last thing is we have a 13mm stubby short socket. This is a 3/8. And our inch torque wrench. There's a few of the bolts that we need to put on that are used in inch increments to torque. So we'll use this torque wrench to do that. And we'll talk about those torque specs as we get going here. So, a couple of the things that we do as we've now disassembled it, we are going to look at some of the parts that need to be inspected. First thing is, like I said before, I cleaned up the oil flinger, and we want to make sure that there is no wear, any abnormal wear along this surface, or on this surface here where the piston ring goes, or even the top surface here where the compressor wheel sits on top of. Same goes for the thrust collar. We want to just make sure that this surface here is nice and clean, doesn't have any scratches on it or wear, and the same on the back side. We want to make sure that this is nice and clean. The bearing housing, we want to inspect our piston ring seal area here and make sure we go all the way around it and make sure that there's no gouges and no wear. This surface right here from this step down here all the way up to where it's tapered off here should be completely smooth. And then as we're looking at the bearing housing, we want to make sure that there's no real deep scratches in the bearing surface here where our journal bearings ride. The seal plate, we want to do the same thing as we did on the bearing housing. This is where the piston ring sits, so we want to make sure that there's no wear there and that this surface is completely smooth. And then on to our exhaust wheel, or our turbine wheel. We want to make sure that this surface where our bearings ride don't have any steps, any grooves, anything that is going to cause some abrasions to our new journal bearings. As you can see, I've polished this up so that we can make sure that there is none of that. And then the final surface, the important surface here on the cartridge is this surface here where the piston ring rides. We want to make sure that there's no that this is nice and clean for our new piston ring. Okay, so the first thing that we do when we put this turbocharger together is that we're going to insert the journal bearings. We're going to use our brand new snap rings, and as you can see from my layout that I had, I like to put all of the stuff laid out so that we can see it all, and you know, we know if we're missing anything. You'll notice from this kit that we send you that there are a few parts that you're probably not going to need in this rebuild. These 8 bolts here you're not going to need, and possibly this clip right here is for a wastegate actuator. So on a H1C turbocharger you would need that clip, but otherwise if it's a non-wastegated turbocharger you're not going to need that wastegate clip. And then the other thing, the final thing you're not going to need is probably this H1 or T4 gasket. So we'll put that over there out of the way. Everything else here you should need. In this case we don't need that clip because ours is a non-wastegated turbo. But everything else in that kit that you see here is what you're going to need to rebuild this turbo. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to put in our snap rings that hold our journal bearings in place. Doesn't matter what side you start with. And this sometimes takes a little bit of practice and a couple tries to get in this this snap ring. Whoop. And this one's going to be a booger. You can pause it right there, okay? Okay, once that is in, okay, this is where we like to take our pick and push our snap ring in and make sure that it is seated correctly in the groove. And you can that feels good, so that's in. Okay, the next thing that we do is when we reassemble our turbochargers, we use motor oil. We find that it's you know, we're already putting in the oil in the turbocharger on startup, so we might as well give it a little bit to start with. Put a little oil inside the bearing housing, put a little bit on the journal bearing, and drop it in. And now we're going to put the other snap ring on top of it. And we use our pick to make sure it's in there all the way, and push the snap ring around, make sure it feels good, make sure that the journal bearing is in there and it's loose, it looks like it feels like it's going to spin. Then we repeat the process on this side here, on the compressor side. And if your snap ring falls out like mine did, just push it back out through the oil port and try again. Okay, this one's in. I'm going to double check it with our pick. Make sure we push it into the grooves and it seats correctly all the way around. Great. Put a little oil in. Grab our bearing. Some oil on this. Never hurts to have too much is it's not a problem in this case. Okay, put the bearing in. Put our last snap ring in. Use our pick again and make sure that is in. Make sure our bearing, our journal bearing, slides around like it should, and that looks good. Okay, our next step is our thrust collar. We're going to go ahead and just add some more oil, set our collar right there. Put some more oil here. And now it's time that we set our thrust bearing in place. You can see that the thrust collar does sit down below and it will move around. Just try to get it as center as possible. It's not going to sit up into the thrust bearing until the shaft comes through. Okay, now we're going to put in our thrust bearing. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and put in our Torx screws here. Go ahead and get them started by hand. And one tool that I failed to mention at the beginning was the Torx bit for this. This is a number 20 Torx bit. So we're going to go ahead and use this to and if you want, you can use your 1/4 inch ratchet. Get those down. Just go ahead and snug them up a little bit. Okay, this is the first part where we are going to use our torque wrench, our torque ratchet. We're going to go ahead and set this at 20 inch-pounds. Not very tight. Go ahead and torque those down. Those should be set. Okay, now the next part, we're going to go ahead and put our back plate together. And so first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take our O-ring that fits in this slot right here, put a little bit of Vaseline on the O-ring, drop it in this slot here, move that out of the way, make sure it's seated in there. Then we're going to take our oil slinger, it's sometimes called a slinger, sometimes a flinger, and put our new piston ring on here like this, and we're going to go ahead and set this in here like this. Should look like that. No parts are going to fall out when we flip it over. And we're going to take our oil diffuser or oil deflector, set it right there, like so. Take our back plate that we just assembled together with our oil slinger and our O-ring. And we're going to go ahead and just drop it on here like this and flip it over. Make sure our bolts are lined up. Now we're going to take these 4 bolts that already have Loctite on them, which is nice. And go ahead and start these by hand. And at this point I'm going to use this 1/4 inch ratchet with our extension with our 8 on it. And set these down. Always. Okay, so we've got all of these cinched down. We went into our cross pattern making sure that all of them are tight, good and snug. And that's that. So now we've got our bearing housing sill plate assembly put together, and we're ready to insert our wheels. The first thing I always like to do is I like to check this new piston ring inside of here to make sure that it goes in nice and smooth. That way, if it hangs up for some reason or another, you can really investigate why, instead of trying to fight the exhaust wheel or the turbine wheel as you set it in place. Set the heat shield on top and put our piston ring on our exhaust wheel or turbine wheel like so. We always like to again add some more oil. Put some oil on our shaft and slide this straight down. You wiggle it around a little bit to get it through that collar on the other end and push it through like so. And like to just kind of spin it here a little bit to get the piston ring to sit, and sets in just like that. It should go in nice and easy. You shouldn't have to force it. You shouldn't have to hit it with a hammer. It should go in just nice and easy. Okay, now at this point we're going to put our compressor wheel on. At this point also, if you have purchased one of our 60 millimeter or 62 millimeter compressor wheels for some more air and get your lower EGTs, get you a little bit more power, this is where you would put on our new compressor housing and compressor wheel upgrade. Nice new wheel, comes pre-balanced so that you don't have to worry about putting it on and not having it already balanced. They come pre-balanced for your convenience. Today we're not going to put that compressor upgrade on there. We're just going to go ahead and continue with our rebuild process and put our stock compressor wheel back on. We've inspected our wheel. We've made sure that it's nice and clean, that there's no damage to it, no abnormal wear, and we're going to go ahead and just slide this back on like so. Sometimes, depending on the compressor wheel and the turbine wheel combination, it can be a little bit hard, but you should be able to put it on by hand. You don't need to press it on. It should just be able to slide on pretty free. One last point that I failed to mention was the shaft nut. We do need to reuse the shaft nut. So we take our shaft nut. It is a reverse thread. Just always remember that it's reverse thread. We put that on by hand, tighten it down. Make sure at this point that our cartridge spins as it should. If for some reason it's not, that's when you need to take it back apart and investigate further on why it is hanging up. Okay, at this point right now we're going to go ahead and we're going to torque down with our 13 millimeter socket. We're going to torque this to 135 inch-pounds. Cut it. Okay, we've got our torque wrench set at 135 inch-pounds, and again this is reverse threads. We're going to go ahead and take this over to our vise, and we're going to clamp the tail end, just the tail end, into our vise so that it can it can hold our turbine wheel while we tighten the compressor wheel. Okay, the other thing that need to be noted is that when you do take apart your turbine wheel or your turbo before, you need to make sure that you put some indicator marks on your compressor wheel and your exhaust wheel, so that when we torque this back together, it'll be lined up like it was from the factory. That is going to be the safest way, without having to rebalance, to put it back together and have less worry about it. So we've got our indicator mark right here on this side, and we're going to go ahead and line it up with our compressor. And when you torque, sometimes the compressor wheel moves. You'll just have to adjust it accordingly as it is. You can see that the cartridge still turns. Torque it to 135 inch-pounds, and go ahead and take it out of the vise. Okay, we're going to take it out like that. Make sure it still spins nice and free. It's good if you've got some oil coming out of your bearing housing. That means you know you put enough oil into it. Okay, now at this point we want to make sure that we get the O-ring on this back plate. If we fail to put the O-ring on, you will have a leak, and it will cause you all sorts of boost problems. Put a little Vaseline on it. Go ahead and slide it on there. And again, if we're doing the 60mm compressor upgrade, this is where you would obviously put on the new compressor wheel, or compressor housing with the new compressor wheel. If you remember from our teardown video, we did mark our housings with an indicator, so we knew exactly where we needed to put it to put this thing back together and have it oriented and rotated correctly. Set it in here, line it up, because we lined it up with our oil inlet. Put that right there, like so. And we're going to take our V-band clamp that holds the compressor housing to the rest of our turbo here. We have a new nut that Wholeset provides us. This is where we're going to use our 11mm deep socket. We want to make sure that the threads don't hinder us when we're tightening this down. Take off our 13, put on our 11. Switch it back to regular forward threads and torque this. We are going to torque this to 110 inch-pounds. Okay, we've set our torque wrench at 110 inch-pounds. I'm going to go ahead and torque this to that. Okay, after it hits the mark, we always like to try to tap our clamp just to make sure that it seats correctly, and then just double check our torque. You'll see that it will give a little bit. Alright, so now we're all put together. We want to make sure that it still spins free, that we don't have any dragging on our compressor side, and everything on this one seems to be good. We don't seem to be dragging on the housings at all, so far our rebuild kit's doing what it's supposed to. Alright, and now we're going to take our turbine housing. Again, at this point, if you have purchased one of our exhaust upgrades, our turbine upgrades, the 16 centimeter, the 14 centimeter short, or the 12 centimeter short, this is where you would install the turbine housing. Today we pulled a 16 centimeter just just to show you, this one's nice and clean. This is where you would just easily drop it in and put your bolts in. But instead today, for this purpose, we're just going to put our old 18 centimeter back on. And again, on this housing, we have put our indicator on where our oil inlet is so that we can line everything properly. It's always a good idea to clean this surface here and make sure that when we put this back together that we can move fairly free. Obviously, it's going to have some buildup that might cause us some issues, but we want to make sure that we can try to slide be able to rotate this here a little bit. Okay, at this point we're going to take our lock plates and our clamp plates. I set those clamp plates in place there. You might have to flip these one way or another to get these to line up on your exhaust, on your turbine housing. So we put the lock plates on, and you might find that when you tore down your turbo that there was no lock plates on them. Holset decided to put them on sometimes and sometimes not. So I think it's never a bad idea. It wouldn't be the end of the world if you didn't. These turbine housings are not known to have the bolts back out. But in this case, we want to be safe, so we're going to go ahead and put those lock plates in. Okay, cinch these down. Make sure we're good and tight. It's always a good time to go in the cross pattern, just to make sure that the housing goes down evenly. And really just snug them down. This spec is actually about 200 inch-pounds, but you can usually just feel it and really just get them nice and snug. Okay, now our turbocharger is all back together. It still spins nice and free. Make sure it doesn't make any dragging noises. Make sure that exhaust turns nice and free. Just look over your successful rebuild. Obviously, we've got our gaskets here to put it back together. We also like to put more engine oil down into the oil hole, the oil inlet. Put some oil in there, and then. Okay, so now we've successfully completed our H1C Turbo upgrade. As you can see, the turbo is nice and free. It doesn't drag in any way. It looks good. You should feel good about the rebuild that you've done. As you can see, this is our turbo rebuild that we did just to show for the video. The stuff that as we do our rebuilds, we do a little bit more of an extensive process when we more rigorous processes we do our rebuilds. We sandblast the housings. We make sure that every part of the turbocharger is within spec, and also do a zero balance on all of our turbochargers here at Gillett Diesel. So if you have any questions about the rebuild process or about any of the parts that we went over that might have wear on them that you have questions about, feel free to contact us. We will be more than happy to sell you those parts individually so that you can also have a successful rebuild of your H1C turbocharger. Again, I'm Steve with Gillett Diesel, and you can reach us at 801-571-7780, or check us out on our website at gillettdiesel.com. Thanks for joining us today.